Hello, everybody. Welcome to night 12 of our Lambda School mini boot camp. So we've been through a lot together. We dealt with some front-end topics such as HTML and CSS, and then we've spent a few weeks just laying out all the basics of JavaScript. And today we are going to tie it all together with a really great topic, which is DOM manipulation. So for anyone who is new with us tonight, my name is Deandra Ryan Moss, and I am an instructor at Lambda School, and this is our mini bootcamp series. So our mini bootcamp is a 3-week-long course that's a introduction to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we start from the very beginning. Tonight is the last lesson of the course, so if you're just with us for the first time, you might want to go back and check out some of the old videos, or we start a new mini bootcamp in April, and you're welcome to enroll in that. And if you're curious a little bit about what Lambda School is, our main curriculum is a 6-month web development and computer science immersive. So over the course of 6 months, we teach you how to go from having some basics to being ready to be in the field, on the job, a computer programmer. So it's a really great course. As I said, it's 6 months long full-time or a year long in the evenings. We teach you a variety of topics. Everything we've introduced in this course, we're going to dive into in such a deep way, as well as talking about back-end programming, more front-end frameworks, and then a variety of just basic computer science topics like algorithms and programming in some other language such as C and Python. So if you're interested at all in the main course, be sure to reach out, learn a little bit more, and we always prioritize mini bootcamp students in our admissions process. So let's go ahead and jump on into the topic for tonight. So last night we saw recursion, which, as I said, is one of my favorite topics. Hopefully you guys had some fun with the homework on that. I'll do a brief review on that, and then we are going to talk about DOM manipulation, which is what ties everything together. It's how we use all these JavaScript skills we've been learning to actually create web apps. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and then we can jump on into the actual coding. All right, one moment. Okay, let's do a quick review of recursion before we get on to DOM manipulation. So recursion, simply put, is when a function calls itself. But as we saw last night, while that's a simple idea in theory, the reality of it can be pretty mind-boggling. So one example that we dealt with last night was this idea of writing a count down function. So a count down function takes in some sort of starting value, and then we want it to log whatever that value is down to 0. So if we called countdown of 5, we'd want it to log 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And while we could accomplish this in a loop, the recursive approach is a little crazier. So what we do in recursion is we always check for our base case. So in this case, we're curious, start happens to be less than 0. If start is ever less than 0, we know we're done with our countdown. So we use return to quit out of the function. If not, we can console log our value, and then we can recursively call countdown on start minus 1. And in this way, we're able to log our countdown from our start value. So the important takeaways here are we always want some sort of quit criteria, or else we'll end up with an infinite loop, and that understand that when we call this function again, that we are creating a totally different function. So I used the example last night of Russian dolls, and I think that's a really great way to imagine recursive functions. They're like functions stacked inside of functions. So when we call countdown of 5, inside of that, we're also calling countdown of 4, countdown of 3, sorry, And I'm not going to type out the rest, but we'll call this all the way down to countdown of -1, actually. And that will tell us to quit. So keep in mind that while this looks like one function call, inside of it, there's actually 7 function calls going on. That is recursion for you. So hopefully you guys had some fun last night playing with that, with the Fibonacci sequence and the factorials. Tonight we won't be doing any recursion, but I will say that recursion is kind of out of sight in the topic of DOM manipulation because, as I mentioned last night, while we can use recursion to write something like this countdown function, which could be accomplished with a loop, the real reason that we love recursion is because it's great for tree structures. So if we're dealing with decision trees or objects within arrays within object, recursion is our friend. And it turns out that the DOM, which you guys will be introduced to tonight, is exactly that kind of spidering tree-like object. So we ourselves won't have to write any recursion tonight, but just so you know, a lot of the methods that we'll use probably have some recursion going on. So that's a little extra tidbit, but I'll mention that as we go along because it's sometimes nice to see how these different topics connect. Well, enough recursion. Let's go ahead and talk about the DOM. So what is the DOM? Well, before we even answer that question, there's kind of a bigger question, which is, how does all this JavaScript stuff we've been learning relate to web development? So we've done a lot of cool different stuff about JavaScript so far in the last few weeks, but not much of it really seems to have to do with building websites. It seems a little more computer science-y, like something like the countdown function. That's logical and interesting, but how does that help us build websites? And the answer is the DOM. So we saw HTML and CSS at the beginning of this course, and we learned that HTML is the tool we use to design our website. So let me pull out this code base here. So here's an HTML example of, here's an example of the HTML of a very simple web page. Every single thing that's on the web page, every element has a tag that's written out in HTML. So that's kind of our foundation, our core structure, the framing of our website. And then we also learn CSS, which applies the style. So if we look at the website that's the web page that I've actually pulled up here, we can see that there's headers, there's a button, there's a paragraph here. All of those things are also have some styling, right? We have different fonts, some borders, some backgrounds, some margins. That is all CSS. So what is JavaScript then? How does this play into the picture? Well, the answer is that if we want a dynamic web page, we need JavaScript. So for example, check out this button. It doesn't do anything. Whenever we have a button that actually functions, that's JavaScript. JavaScript is telling the code behind the scenes what happens when that button clicks. It also relates to elements moving around, any sort of animation. It relates to just different kind of responsive effects. Like, I'll come back to this later, but for example, in CodePen, when I hover over these buttons, they change colors. That's all JavaScript behind the scenes. And so JavaScript is really important. It helps. Something without JavaScript is called a static web page, in that everything's on the screen and you can see it, but you can't interact with it, versus a dynamic web page, which is something that's interactive. And in this day and age, pretty much everything is interactive. So JavaScript is huge. So, so that brings us to the DOM. The DOM is what makes this possible. So JavaScript communicates with HTML by creating this object, which is an abstract representation of everything on the page. So we have, of course, our actual HTML and our actual HTML file, but we also have this abstract JavaScript representation of it called the DOM. So put that aside for a minute. That's kind of just a high-level explanation of what we're going to go into. But feel free to be a little confused right now, because I think it'll start to make a lot more sense once we dive in. Before I get into that, though, I just want to talk a little bit about how we actually incorporate JavaScript into our code base. Bold and Sublime text. There are 3 files. Their file, which we've seen, our CSS file, which we've seen, and this JavaScript file. So there's some of this should look familiar from all of our JavaScript learning, but there's a lot of other stuff going on here that probably looks kind of crazy. You will understand what's going on here by the end of tonight. But on a high level, this is just telling the page what it should do when that button is clicked. So we have our index.html, and that is what the web browser reads. And then down here on line 5, we have a link to our style sheet. So that is telling the web browser, read this style. I get rid of it and reload this page, all of our styling is gone. So anything beyond the HTML page needs to be linked somehow. And that occurs within the head, which is kind of this metadata section of HTML pages. So as I showed you before, let's bring our button doesn't do anything right now. And that's because nowhere in this HTML page have we told it to check out this, this J. And there are 2 ways to do it. Both involved a script tag. So I will go ahead and put a script tag in here. Another HTML tag, we have the opening and closing. Actually, just start to write JavaScript in here. You know, I could some JS. So I could just throw some JavaScript straight in there. And if I go over here and load the page again, that console log appears. So we know that script tag is working. That is not a bad goal if you just want to test a couple things out, but that's not really how we like to link in JavaScript. Just like we want our CSS to all be in a separate file, it's the same with JavaScript or JavaScript logic outside of our HTML page and in its own. So what we do is we use source, just like with image, and then we can go ahead and link in that index.js. So this will probably work, but there's a couple other things you want to do. You want to throw in type, which is always going to be text/JavaScript. And then, of course, the source. And then it's also good to throw in this async keyword. So that is essentially telling it to load this page after everything else is done. We want the JavaScript to come in last. And that is what this async keyword will do. Sounds like I'm having some audio problems here. Let me see if I can get that resolved. One moment. All right. Well, hopefully that helped out with the sound. If there's more connection issues, just let me know. Is about linking in our JavaScript file. So we use the script tag, we specify the type, we specify the source, which is the actual file, and then we throw in this async keyword, which tells it to load that HTML is already loaded. So essentially, it'll just help load the page at the right moment and not slow down the load of the page. Change the functionality over here. So now when I click the button, look at that. Something new appeared on the page. So that is a little example of how JavaScript can be used to create a dynamic web page. And once again, by the end of the lesson, you will know how to do what I just did with this button. So that is just kind of a crash course in how we connect our JavaScript to our HTML. For the rest of the class, we will be using CodePen, which is really great because you don't have to worry about that. It does it automatically. The bad news is you don't get practice linking your script, but it's awfully nice that we can just start writing things out of the box using this awesome tool. Okay, so let's look at the actual DOM. So as I mentioned before, the DOM is this JavaScript abstraction of what's on the web page. So you can see here, either by looking at the rendering of the page itself or by looking at our simple HTML over here, that we have this larger div. That's kind of this purple box. Inside of it, we have an H2, 2 paragraphs, and an image. So this is all HTML, of course, but there exists this object called document that contains a copy of all this data, but in JavaScript form. So let me pull out the console and I can show you what I mean. So available in our global scope here is this variable called document. And this thing is an object, and it refers to everything on the screen. And because we're using CodePen, it's not just actually, let me do this in our other example. This will probably be a little more clear. So I'm going to pull out document. And when I click on it, everything highlights because document represents everything on the web page. And when I click inside it, I can see that there is this, this head inside of it, which doesn't really light anything up, and then this body, which represents the whole thing. And then there's a div, another div, a third div. And if we dive inside of this middle one, we can see our button and our paragraph down there. So let me clarify one thing about this document, which is this might raise the question of what are we looking at here? Is this HTML or is this JavaScript? Because it kind of looks like HTML, doesn't it? It's actually JavaScript. This is one of those things where something that ultimately is helpful can be kind of a hindrance when you're a beginner at this, which is that when we log this JavaScript object, instead of giving us this big convoluted object with lots of curly brackets and key value pairs, it renders on screen in this really actually pretty user-friendly way that makes it very clear what we're dealing with, which is something that relates to HTML. But in reality, this document thing is just an object. It's just one of these curly bracket objects with lots of properties and methods and arrays and more objects hidden on it. So that is what document is. This document variable is a JavaScript object. It's a very sophisticated JavaScript object that has lots of complex features inside of it and lots of cool methods, but it is just an object. So remember that as we go. This isn't literally HTML code. It is actually JavaScript code that is designed in a way to abstractly represent HTML, which allows us to use JavaScript to manipulate the actual HTML on here. So let's go ahead and show you some of the cool things that we can do with document. So back over to CodePen. The very first thing I'm going to show you is selecting. So every single one of these elements, this header, these paragraphs, this image, this overall div, all of these exist inside of the DOM as their own JavaScript objects, these kind of smaller objects that live within the larger object of the DOM. And if we want to mess with them in any way, we have to find some way to grab them and save them into a variable. That is what selecting is for. So let's try and select, let's go ahead and select both of these paragraphs. I will show you a method called getElementsByClassName. So document, remember that's the global variable that refers to the entire document. Document is how we're always going to start. All these methods that we're going to use today are, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them are methods on document itself. So all these selectors are going to be of the form document dot whatever the selector is. So this first one is getElementsByClassName. And this method takes in an actual class name. So I'm going to use this class of child, which both of these paragraphs have the class child. So I go ahead and throw child in there. And it is going to spit back out all of the elements with the class child. So child else. And then let me go ahead and console log this thing to see what we've managed to select. Uh-oh. Sometimes the console in this thing is a little finicky. Come on. Well, let me see if I can throw it right directly in the console and get anything. Let's try changing this class name. Child P. Right. Well, that is bear with me. Well, something is going wrong here. I'm not quite sure what it is. What we would expect to happen here is that these two elements with this child P class would be returned to us, but for some reason, the console log is not happy. Let me see if I can get it to work just in this version of the console. Do I need? Don't think I need that. Nope. Well, I'm sorry, guys. That's not working as planned. Oh, here we go. Okay. I don't know what magic I just did, but I got it to work. So we selected everything by the class name child P. And sure enough, we got this object back called an HTML collection, which is, you can essentially think of it as an array containing HTML elements. So we see that there are two items in here. This p.child p, which is our first paragraph, and then the second one. So in this way, we've pulled out what's essentially an array containing both of these elements. So that is our first selection that we've made. Let's try another one. We just want to grab, so this was a selector by class. If we instead want to select something by ID, we use get element by ID. So notice that before it was elements because classes, there might be multiple things with the same class, whereas if we do ID, it's going to be unique. So the method is just get element by ID. So I'm going to do parent, which is the ID I have on this overall div here. I'll save this as parent, and then let's log that. I think this console is working now for whatever reason. Cool. So this went ahead and logged our parent. So it not only showed us this parent element, but all the children element within it. So once again, even though this is rendering on the screen, looking like HTML, it's actually a JavaScript object as HTML. This way I wanted to somehow mess with the children or the parent, we would have access to them. There's a couple other ways to grab elements. They're called query selectors. So we will do query selector, and this will go ahead and grab the first element that matches whatever you put in there. So I'll do, okay. So log this. So this went ahead and grabbed our image. And because we only have one image on our page, it there was no ambiguity about what it was grabbing. It just grabbed the only image. But if we instead did P, notice that it grabbed the first paragraph and ignored the second paragraph. So this is a sticking point for people who are new to DOM methods, which is that query selector will only grab the first one, even if there are multiple on the page. If instead we wanted all of the P's, we could do query selector all. And our console is being angry again. It doesn't like these arrays, apparently. Okay, so the result here was this node list, which gave us both of these. Once again, essentially an array that contains both of these paragraphs. And so while I've been using query selector with these actual tag names, we can also do it with, classes. So we would just do .child p if we want to grab everything with that class. And once again, we get that same node list because both of those have that child p class. We can select with IDs by throwing in hash parent. That goes ahead and gives us this div parent element. So the takeaway here is that if we want to mess with any of the elements on the screen, if we wanted to somehow mess with the heading or the image or the paragraphs, we have to grab them first. And we can grab them using any of these 4 selectors. We can get elements by class name, get a single element by ID, use query selector to get the first item that matches some sort of criteria, or query selector all. So those are the 4 main ways of selecting. Technically, there is a 5th selector, but we'll get to that a little later. So the fun part is actually messing with the elements once we've selected them. So let's look at how that works. I'm going to go ahead and do query selector on my P element. So once again, this will give us our very first paragraph. So this mighty fine paragraph here is going to be, the DOM representation of it is going to be saved into this variable. So as is often the case with objects, first P has an attribute, has a number of attributes on it. One of them is something called inner HTML. So let me go ahead and console log first P.inner HTML. So inner HTML gives us the actual text that's inside of here. So if we wanted to find out what this element contained, the text inside of it, we could use this inner HTML attribute. But what's cool is we could also reassign this attribute. So if I wanted to change what this paragraph actually said, all I'd have to do is redefine this attribute on first P. And once again, I'm just using this exact same syntax that we'd use for objects, because that's what first P is. It's a JavaScript object. It's an object that represents an HTML element, but fundamentally it's JavaScript. So using this JavaScript, we're able to actually alter what appears on the screen. And that's what's really cool about the DOM, is even though it's JavaScript, it's think of it as being linked to the HTML. So when we alter the object, we alter what appears on the screen as well. So the thing we do is, let's go ahead and grab that image instead. So I'll use query selector. Go ahead and grab the image. There's only one, so we don't have to worry about which image we've grabbed. And images contain an attribute called source. And up here, we can see what the source was already set to. But if we want to change that to, let's say, a different size random image, that works. So let me make that even more obvious. We can just keep altering that, and the source of the image keeps changing. There is another way to change the source. There's something called a set attribute method. So instead, we could do image. Let me comment this out. So that's one way of changing the image source. Another way would be image.set attribute. We specify we want to change the source. And then we could go ahead and grab this new URL, throw it in here, and we changed it again. So this is the set attribute method is not source specific. So our first argument in here says we want to deal with source in this case, but if you wanted to say set the attribute of href or some other attribute, you could use the same method. So let's see, what else do we want to do? Let's mess with the class name. So right now, both of these paragraphs are set to this class called child P. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and create another child P, a child P2 class, and we'll say that the font color in this is red. So right now, nothing on the screen has this class of child P. But if we went ahead and selected our first paragraph, we could then do p.className. And right now it would be child P, but we could change that to child P2. And now the class name, even though in the literal HTML, this element still says child P, we've overwritten it with child P2 using DOM manipulation. And so now it's going to check in our CSS and say, hey, I guess we want the color to be red. So one way to kind of change styling using JavaScript would be to change classes or IDs. Another way is to just change the styling directly. So every single one of these HTML elements has a .style attribute, and .style is actually an object. So let me actually console log this. It probably will get mad at me, say it's too big, but let's try it. Here it is. So this whole thing is just a gigantic JavaScript object. All these things are attributes on this huge JavaScript object, and we can change any of these and through it change the style. So let's go ahead and do that. So p.style, it basically has an attribute for every single CSS thing you can think of. So let's do border. Cool. So we used this border attribute on the style object, which is on P, and we changed it to 1 pixel solid black border. And sure enough, on our page, the web page responded accordingly to us changing the DOM. So this is a nice little opportunity to remind you that this document object is really deep. There's lots of crazy nested things inside of it. There are the elements themselves, which are already nested. And then within each element, there's a style object, which contains all these other attributes. So I know you haven't seen an object this complicated before, but just bear with me, and hopefully you guys are learning how to do some cool things. I'm going to go is that forget everything when it comes to the DOM, because there are a million different attributes. Documentation is our friend. So the takeaway here is not memorize everything she's throwing on the screen. Absolutely not. The more general takeaway is, okay, what is the DOM? How does it relate to the actual HTML? How do I use it? What happens when I select? What happens when I change attributes? So we want to think about this on a much higher level, or it becomes so overwhelming. So we just saw kind of the basics of DOM manipulation, which is we want to be able to select, we want to be able to grab elements off of the DOM, and then we want to be able to mess with them, change their class or change their style. Yeah, or change their source, which we saw with the picture, maybe change their text, like I did with the paragraph. And that's all really cool, but we're going to do something even more awesome now, which is actually add stuff to the DOM. So far, we've only been augmenting things that are already on the screen, but let's go ahead and add something totally new. So this brings us to our, which I said we would get back to, and that is document.create element. And I'm going to just create a paragraph. So this thing creates a new paragraph. And where did our image go? There it is. Okay, so an important point here, and I remember this really confused me when I first learned this topic, which is that we've created this new P element. It's a new paragraph, basically, but it's not attached to the DOM. There's no new paragraph up on here. It's kind of just floating abstractly out in the ether. So it is a new object that represents a paragraph, but it's in no way connected to the DOM yet. So that's a really important point. When we just run create element, we haven't added anything to the DOM. We've just kind of created this disembodied paragraph or whatever we decide to create. And I will, of course, show you how to actually attach it to the DOM, but let's go ahead and mess with it a little first. And I'm going to try and see why my image is freaking out on me. I don't know. Well, oh well. Maybe I'll just get rid of that image for now. Okay, cool. So we've created this disembodied paragraph. It's not going to be very interesting if it doesn't have any text. And we can use that same syntax that we already saw. We saw that there is this inner HTML attribute, and we can use it to assign text or values to the element. So brand new paragraph. Read paragraph with some text on it. Let's add some style. That's something else we saw. So style dot border. Just do my favorite. Actually, let's do a dashed border. Getting a little crazy tonight. We add a border. So we're not getting any visual feedback here. So there's kind of this, sinking feeling in the chest of like, am I just writing nonsense code that's not doing it? Is created this disembodied paragraph, set some text on it, and then thrown a border onto it using our style attribute. So now finally, if we want to actually get some feedback here, we certainly want DOM. So we're going to throw it on this main parent div. So first we need to grab that. So I'll call this parent div. I can use document query selector and go ahead and throw in, I'll use ID to select it. I could just use div as well because there's only one div on here, but I go with ID because it's more specific and I feel quite confident I'm grabbing the thing I want. So I went ahead and selected that, and then it turns out that parent div, that these HTML elements have this method on them called, and we're going to go ahead and append on our new paragraph. And there it is. So what did we just do here? Well, we created this disembodied element. We added some text, some style to it. And then we grabbed our parent element, which is this div, this whole box, and we appended it on. So whenever we call append child, it sticks it on the end. So if that image had still been in there, it would have gone after that. So that is how append child works. And that is how we add things to the DOM, that this paragraph didn't exist at all. It's nowhere hard-coded into our HTML, yet using nothing but JavaScript, we've created it, we've assigned text to it, we've assigned style to it, and then we've stuck it on the DOM, which means on the screen. So write HTML. Well, I mean, if we wanted, we could do all of this logic inside of the JavaScript part of our code. That would not be a good idea, right? HTML is designed to do what HTML does. It's a really great tool for building out elements. CSS is a really great tool for styling them. We don't want to just build things in JavaScript because we can. That is not it's not a very efficient use of our tools. So why would we do this then? Well, it comes back to this idea of an interactive page. If we just want this new paragraph on the page from the get-go, then yeah, we should go ahead and hard code it into the HTML. That's where it belongs. But if, like this example over here, we perhaps want an element that appears after an event happens, or like in CodePen, we want some sort of style change on an event like hovering, that's the point when we want to use JavaScript, when we want DOM and change things. So that brings us nicely into our topic, which is, so I told you that you'd, oops, let's refresh this. I told you by the end of today that you would know how to create this awesome click effect. Well, that requires an event listener. So an event listener is when we use JavaScript to say, hey, when the user does something, you know, whether it's click a button or hover or move their mouse, something should happen. So event listeners are set on HTML elements. So I'm going to go ahead actually and add a button here. And while you would usually think of a click as happening on a button, really we could set a click on a paragraph or a header, or even the entire div if we wanted. It just wouldn't be very user-friendly because we all intuitively know buttons are for clicking. So let's go ahead and grab that button, because if we want to do something to it, we need to pull it off of the DOM. So we'll use, once again, document query selector. We'll throw in our button. It's the only one on the screen, so we know we're going to get the right one. And then we use a method called add event listener. The add event listener takes in two arguments. The first is the actual event. So I'm going to do click. This event could be something like a hover or a mouse movement, but click is the one we use for this. The second is a callback function. Yes, callback functions rear their ugly head. And so this function is telling add event listener, what do I want to happen when I click? So inside of here, logic. So let's say that on that, I want a new element to appear. Well, we just saw how to create a new element, right? I'll go ahead and create another paragraph. And so we have to do document.create element. On a P. Let's give it some text. And we could style it, but let's keep it simple. So we've created this disembodied paragraph. I gave it a little bit of text, and then I need to actually put it on the DOM, or else we'll never be able to see it. So let's grab our parent. And then we can use what we just saw, that append child, and go ahead and throw new P on here. But we're combining topics from tonight and some topics from earlier this week into one grand event listener. So what's happening here is I'm saying I want to add an event listener on this button. So we're waiting for an event. That event is a click. And when a click occurs, do the following. create a new paragraph, give it some text, and then append it onto the parent div. So appending it, we'll stick it on the very end. So let's see if this worked. Look at that. We clicked, and that new, and all this code inside the function scope ran, and we were able to append an element. So that is DOM manipulation in a nutshell. That is how JavaScript fits into web development. And before I set you guys loose, I just want to talk about a couple other things that I think will help you out, both in terms of practical use and in how to think about and conceptualize everything I've introduced you to tonight. So the first thing I want to talk about is the documentation. As I mentioned, we absolutely do not expect you to memorize all of these methods. That would be crazy if you did, because there are so many. So let me just pull up the documentation here. So in W3 Schools, there's a whole section on the DOM. There's the DOM itself, all of its attributes, events, which we just saw. There is our click. But look, there's like, I don't know, like 50 of these. So these are all possible things that the user could do that would trigger an event. So there's the style. We talked about the style object. This thing also has a bajillion attributes, because essentially everything you can do in CSS is represented on this style object. So use this documentation heavily. Don't be afraid of it, because it is your friend, and trying to just remember this is, most of our brains are not capable of that. So documentation, big fan of it. The other thing I wanted to talk about real quickly before we do questions is just kind of a high-level context of this. So even though this is really cool and really powerful and great for things like little click results, oh cool. I will admit that this is not what production code base would look like ever. So what we've just seen is how to use raw JavaScript to manipulate the DOM, and that's totally valid. We can do it. We can do really powerful things with this. It would just be very complicated. But in the real world, there are frameworks and libraries that make this much simpler. So the most common one is jQuery. jQuery is a library out there that a lot of this logic that we've seen today, and makes it even simpler and more user-friendly. Tons and tons of websites use jQuery. It's super common, super popular. We'll, of course, cover it in the main curriculum. So don't fear, if you're taking that, you will be introduced to jQuery. But beyond jQuery, there are frameworks, which are extremely advanced libraries. Things like React or Angular, which abstract out the entire process of writing the front end of your web page. At the core, what is going on in all of these libraries is this manipulation, using this document object to augment things. So keep this in mind. Even though this is a great place to start, you probably, throughout Lambda school and developer, you won't really be using the document object, but it's still extremely important to learn, because underneath the hood, powerful tools that the web is built on are based off of this crazy little object. And now you have some ideas of how to use it. So for our homework tonight, you will be building a web app. So you'll be taking everything we've learned throughout these 3 weeks and putting it to app. This assignment is a little challenging, I'll admit. So I don't want you guys to panic, and I want you guys to feel like you have to accomplish it tonight. This is the last episode in the course, so you really have as long as you to work on it. That doesn't mean put it off, but that doesn't mean to feel stressed or rushed. If you are starting Lambda school soon, you will have a deadline by our admissions team. You need to rush this in one night. And also, if there's other pieces of homework that you've kind of skipped over or gotten stuck on, feel free to take this time to go back and rewatch the videos online. Make sure you really understand it. I know that this is fast-paced. We throw a lot of cool stuff at you in a short amount of time. Now is the moment to kind of take a deep breath, go back, and try and get a little bit more mastery over all these great topics. All right, so that is it for our mini boot camp. It's been really great to be with you guys through this. I hope that everything that we've done this week and the last few weeks is starting to make sense, and that you guys are starting to get this picture of everything that's possible through web development. It's been really exciting to get to teach for you guys. If you have any questions, definitely throw them into Slack. I have a little bit more time to address them tonight. And of course, hopefully you'll be going through and revisiting some of the homework problems, and will continue to be available on Slack. So let's see if we have any questions for tonight. All right, I see a few people typing, so I'll go ahead and wait for them. Okay, Michelle asked when I had the image up why it was constantly changing. That's because that image URL that I used, it came from this website that just automatically generates images, and they change every few minutes. So that wasn't anything having to do with DOM manipulation. If I had used a different URL static image, it would have stayed static. I just used a link that linked to an image that changed. So nothing fancy going on there. Okay, Alberto asked if it's better to learn vanilla JavaScript DOM manipulation because jQuery slows loading time. I would say, I mean, jQuery is a really powerful tool. It's used all over the web. If you're using it correctly, it's going to be fine. It's perfect code. The biggest, like I'm pretty sure Google, but I would still recommend learning the vanilla JavaScript DOM manipulation, learning to use that document object, just because it gives you an important context for understanding libraries like jQuery and then more complicated frameworks as you go along. Any more questions? Okay, well, I'm going to call it a night then. And once again, thank you guys so much for being part of the mini boot camp. We will be starting a new one April. So if you're either jumping in last minute and want to start from the beginning, or if there's someone else who you think would benefit from this, definitely tell them to sign up. I'll be looking forward to seeing you then. And in the meantime, feel free to ask questions in Slack and use us as resources. And I hope that I will see you all in the main course at Lambda School. Thank you so much. Bye, guys.